November 1994, the month that saw video arcades introduced to Cruis'n USA, a racing game from Midway allegedly powered by Nintendo's Ultra 64 technology, which isn't necessarily true, but hey, it was popular to a degree that it eventually got a port to the Nintendo 64 console that was ultimately less than stellar. Then along came Cruis'n World and its eventual N64 conversion, which proved a fair bit better. And that brings us to today's subject matter, Cruis'n Exotica, the final game in the Cruis'n series of arcade racers to grace the Nintendo 64 system, and perhaps the best of the bunch, except not really. Well, at least in regards to this N64 conversion, it's been a good long while since I last touched the arcade original. Now, generally speaking, as far as the game itself goes, it's not too bad. It's still pretty much an arcade racing game with wacky car physics that has you bouncing all over the place and doing flips and stuff for a couple seconds added to the clock, pretty much on par with Cruis'n World except somewhat wonkier. At the very least, it's entirely playable if you just want a wacky arcade racer with cars bouncing all over the place like a total car crash, and pretty worthless if you want a more serious racer where your cars drive like actual cars. But let's dig into this one a little more. You have three modes of play in Cruis'n Exotica. You have Cruis'n Challenge, where you partake in a bunch of races and attempt to win first place, or at least any spot in the top three to unlock further tracks, such as circuit tracks where you're racing in laps, and straight up drag races where you can perform a QuickTime button trick to earn nitros for instant speed boosts in other parts of the game. You have Cruis'n Freestyle, where you run a single race on any of the dozen plus arcade tracks, and finally there's the Cruis'n Exotica mode, where you race through each of the arcade tracks and attempt to win first place in order to progress onwards, where the ultimate prize, the mysterious Exotic mode, awaits. As you play through Exotica, you'll earn mileage, and as you gain mileage, you'll eventually unlock different cars, whether they be traditional fare or somewhat outlandish designs. Other cars can also be unlocked by clearing certain tracks and modes under certain conditions, and there's also support for up to 4-player split screen for those with friends. Yep. So as I said, if you're looking for an arcade racer where the cars have weight and stuff and drive like actual cars, then Cruis'n Exotica is not the game for you. Honestly, none of the Cruis'n games are, but Exotica especially. All the cars in this game control very loosely and have very little weight to them, in that a slight collision will cause a massive clusterfuck of a car crash that will undoubtedly slow you down. It's something of a commonality through these Cruis'n games, but feels more so in Exotica, where physics... we don't need no stinking physics. Nor do we need solid controls. Control is an aspect in Cruis'n Exotica that feels a little looser than in World, which had some solid analog control, believe it or not. Now we're back to the Cruis'n USA standards of one small tilt causing you to careen off course, and given the tracks crafted here, careening off course is something that happens more often than not. Certainly doesn't help that all these cars pretty much control the same way. Aside from minor stat differences here and there, driving a rust bucket feels no different from driving a forklift or a plastic slipper or whatever the hell you unlock in this game. Ultimately though, Cruis'n Exotica remains a wacky racer where you try to make it to the finish before time runs out and presumably win the race, which would be the ultimate goal. You can pull off various stunts and tricks to earn a couple seconds on the clock. Some tracks have shortcuts you can use to get the upper hand, and if you have nitros on hand, which you could win in drag races, you can use those to get a temporary boost of speed. It's a simple, straightforward racing game where everything is just wacky and plasticky, and if you're willing to overlook some of its nagging issues, there's some fun to be had here, I guess. Cruis'n Exotica has some rather scenic locales for you to race in, whether it be the Amazon or Atlantis or Mars even, but sadly the overall graphical quality leaves much to be desired, especially considering it follows a visually pleasant Cruis'n World. Everything seems to have a very low resolution, low quality look to it. The heads-up display, some of the textures on the tracks, and particularly with the various cars you drive, which might look worse than the cars in Cruis'n USA did. It's not all bad though. Some of the tracks in Exotica are nice looking tracks, such as the Vegas and the Hong Kong courses. It's just a shame that everything else looks on par with the low resolution version of big rigs over the road racing. On the flip side, Exotica does have some quality sound. Your usual array of car crashing sounds and occasional voice bites that add to the overall cheese of the series, and per usual you have a selection of widely varied tunes to play at your leisure. And they're fine tunes for background noise, I suppose, but they're no Deadwood Ride. But I guess Deadwood Ride would be ill-fitting on a place like Mars, so I don't know. Overall, Cruis'n Exotica on Nintendo 64 is more of the same wacky flippity-flop racing you've come to expect from the Cruis'n series, but not quite on the level of its predecessors. I can't speak for the arcade version because that's a somewhat different game compared to what's on here. Kinda, sort of, slightly. Also, it's been a few years since I last touched it, or like a couple decades. But Exotica on N64 feels like a lesser product despite having some more interesting locales to race in. The lower quality visuals and the looser controls and physics are contributing factors to a somewhat less than stellar package. But at worst, it's still widely playable, and if you're willing to overlook or even overcome its shortcomings, then Cruis'n Exotica does have its moments. It's not one of the better outings in the Cruis'n series, or as far as arcade racers goes, but it's nothing too terrible either. Ultimately, if you're a fan of the Cruis'n series and if you've yet to play this one, it's been a couple decades, certainly worth a shot, but personally, I think I'm just going to stick with Cruis'n World. It's just a better game in comparison.